Right guys, so we're going to have a look at the knee joint here, and to be honest we're going to probably focus a little bit more on the hamstrings, because in general, a lot of the time at least, it's the hamstrings that tend to be a little bit more restrictive in some movements. Hamstring length, so typically that's something that people will report in many different exercises, even leg extensions, hamstring length or flexibility can become a problem. Even hamstring exercises themselves, sometimes people have the goal of increasing hamstring range of motion, or hip range of motion rather, but with the hamstrings being the limiting factor. So we're going to focus a little bit more on that in this video. So first things first, before we get on to the hamstrings, I want to focus on the knee joint itself for a moment. So obviously the knee joint, when we're thinking about the knee joint, the main thing we're concerned with really is hip flexion, or knee flexion rather, and knee extension range of motion. So obviously you do have internal rotation and external rotation at the knee as well, but we're not going to focus too much on that for the purpose of this video, but it is something that can be important in certain contexts, okay, but generally a rarer consideration. So when it comes to knee extension and knee flexion, in the vast majority of cases, people aren't going to have much of a problem with knee extension or knee flexion in positions where the hamstrings aren't going to be a limiting factor, or positions where the quads aren't going to be a limiting factor. And that sounds like a silly comment, but what I mean by that is that both the hamstrings and the quads are technically biarticular muscle groups. That means that they cross both the knee and the hip joint. And essentially, as a rule of thumb, those muscles only really become limiting factors at the knee joint when they're in their lengthened range at the hip joint already, okay? So basically it's when we take the muscle into its lengthened range as a result of moving both joints together. In general, the knee joint itself does not tend to be restrictive of movement in a lot of movements that we do. And what I mean by that is that when someone can't squat down deep, it's rarely a result of a reduction in knee range of motion, because typically it's other joints such as the ankle or the hip that become limiting factors firstly before other muscle groups. Additionally, in terms of knee extension itself, it's relatively rare that someone is going to be limited by their ability to extend their knees, for example, in a standing position. That's a rare instance unless someone has pre-existing injury or injury history, okay? So such as post-ACL reconstruction, it's very common for knee extension to be limited in that context, and that's one of the main goals of ACL rehab, is to get back that knee extension range of motion. And the exact same thing post-total knee replacement, that's something that you will see as well, as that there's going to be a knee extension deficit there, also a knee flexion deficit. So in those contexts where we're talking about the physiotherapeutic side of the spectrum, you can indeed have knee joint limitations independent of the length of the muscle at the other joint, the hip joint. But in a lot of contexts, in an applied exercise context, we're thinking about knee joint restrictions in range of motion typically being the result of the lengthening of biarticular muscles. And I'll explain exactly what that means now as we get into the more applied stuff. So for the purpose of kind of starting this video, if you could actually sit up for me, Paddy, in the position that you are, but actually just move back a bit further in the bench just so that people can see clearly, right? So knee flexion, first of all, as Paddy's sitting here, he's already in a kind of a flexed knee position. So what I can get him to try and do, and obviously we're just doing this in the position that we are because it's what we have accessible, but you could have a bigger kind of plinth or a bed to be able to assess this, a physio bed that is. You could also have, you know, someone lying on the ground when you're assessing this stuff. You could have them sitting in a chair when they're assessing this stuff. But when we look at knee flexion range of motion, we can look at it in a sitting position. So Paddy, if you bring your ankle back towards your bum, I'm seeing how far he can bring back his leg. You can assess that passively by bringing a little bit further with your hand. You're getting an idea of the knee flexion range of motion that's available there. You can also assess that same range of motion in a lying position where someone is face down. You don't need to do that now, but if someone's lying down, and if someone's lying down face down, what you're getting there is the assessment of knee range of motion with the hip in extension, or the hip at least in a neutral position. And what that means is that the hamstrings are in a more shortened position, the quads are in a more lengthened position. So if you have a restriction in prone, that is face down, prone knee flexion, and that seems to be quite restricted, then that could be the result of the quadriceps just being a little bit tight, particularly the rectus femoris, because of the biarticular muscle group. And it might be that that is limiting the ability of the knee to get into that range of motion, or it could be the fact that the hamstrings are not able to produce the requisite knee flexion, or a combination of both, or it could be the knee joint itself, okay? So that's why this is a bit more complicated when we're looking at the relationship between the knee and the hip, because of the nature of the biarticular muscles, okay? So in a basic seated context here, people are typically going to be able to perform flexion just fine. If someone is actually post ACL reconstruction or they're post total knee replacement, you might find that someone can't get 90 degrees, and that might be an early goal for that individual. And it's often the case that people do still work with personal trainers post ACL reconstruction, so you might see these discrepancies in individuals. So if you were looking at, if you were working with an individual like that and you were seeing that when they get to the bottom of a squat, their knee is real tight, or the bottom of a leg press, or even the bottom of a leg extension, because for example, if you're starting a leg extension exercise, often you're actually starting in that position. So if someone can't even get there, then the weight is forcing them down. You might actually want to customize that machine so that they actually start maybe in a more forward position. So that could be something you consider for those individuals who have specific knee diagnoses, or they have surgery, etc. So they've got identified restrictions that you can see. Okay, so there's some of the knee flexion things in this actual position. Then you've got knee extension. Knee extension in this position, this is where the biarticular nature of the hamstrings start to come into play, because what you can see here is that as Paddy's sitting here, his hip is flexed at roughly 90 degrees. So we've got this angle of hip flexion of 90 degrees. And what that means is that the hamstrings are already pulled away from their point of origin, so that they have some degree of lengthening already before the knee even begins to move. Now, as the knee begins to move, if you try and extend your leg, Paddy, obviously he's having to actually lift up his leg here as well, because it's not fully supported. But as he extends it again, he's getting to that top position because he's got good range of motion available. He's got good flexibility of the hamstrings. But in a lot of individuals in this position where they're seated upright, they might only get to maybe 60, 70 degrees, and then the hamstring length is going to be the limiting factor there. And that's because as they extend the knee, it's not just an issue of quadricep strength or knee joint range of motion in terms of like the availability of the joint passively. It's also the availability of hamstring length to allow the knee to get into that position. So that's something that's important to consider, because that does not necessarily mean that the person does not have full knee extension range of motion. Because if Paddy was to lean back more then, you know, or your client, and they then extend the knee, they might get full range of motion. But as they lean forward, it's going to be more difficult, and that might just be the result of hamstring length itself or hamstring flexibility. Okay, so that's just something to be mindful of. Where does that come into practice? Again, we're trying to always bring it back into practice. Where that comes into practice is in something like a leg extension type exercise or a leg curl type exercise. Because if you're doing something like a leg extension, then in the top position, you need to have your knee extended while your hip is flexed in this position that Paddy is in. So in that context, if we have someone who's able to recline more, so we've got a machine that's adjustable and the person can lean back more, it's going to be easier for them to get into that fully extended knee position, because they're not going to be as limited by the hamstrings, versus if you're telling them to lean forward a lot, in which case the hamstrings are going to be more lengthened, and as a result it's going to be more difficult for them to get into the position independent of the quadricep strength that they have. Okay, so that's just something that's quite important to be aware of, guys. Okay, so yeah, just remember the biarticular nature of the hamstrings there make it so that the more the hip is flexed, i.e. the more the person is leaned forward, the more difficult it is going to be for the knee to extend. Okay, now with that said, Paddy, could you lie down on your back for me? This also has implications for the flex knee position in any exercise where you're doing like something like a straight leg raise, for example. Okay, so if you're doing a straight leg raise, we typically think of this as being an ab exercise. So people will often do leg raises as ab exercises, and they'll say, oh, you know, I can't keep my legs straight, you know, I'm too weak to do the exercise. But often that's not the result of ab strength being the deficit at all. It's just that it's really, really difficult to get the leg into that position. Like if you're trying to get your knee up to, or your hip up to 90 degrees of flexion without any bend in the knee, that's just a really difficult thing to do in terms of having the requisite hamstring flexibility and the requisite strength in the quadriceps and the hip flexors. So that's something I just want to get across here in this video, is that for Paddy to be able to bring his leg up, so if you straighten your leg and then bring it up to that kind of 90-degree position, that's quite a difficult task to accomplish, okay? Because not only is that requiring a lot of strength at the front of the hip here with the quadriceps extending the knee, the rectus femoris portion of the quadriceps extending the knee and the hip, and the iliopsoas muscles, the hip flexors, being responsible for flexing the hip. It's also requiring the hamstrings being able to attain a good amount of length, so they have to be able to lengthen at the knee and the hip for him to be able to get into that position. So that's quite a complex movement that requires multiple different components of fitness, you could say. And if we're treating that as our standard for training the abs, for example, then clearly we're bringing in a lot of other moving parts, or not moving parts in this case, all right? So for someone to be able to get into that range of motion, that actually does require all of those things if you're doing it actively. Now, where else does that come into play? That also comes into play in something like a Romanian deadlift, or even your standard deadlifts. Because if you're doing a Romanian deadlift or a stiff leg deadlift, we're typically trying to train the hamstrings in a lengthened range, okay? And the reason for that is that we're taking the hip, we're flexing it, and we're keeping the knee more or less extended. So if you think about what that looks like, if you get into the same position again for me, Paddy, leg up again. That's basically what Paddy's going to be like. So he's kind of keeping on maybe a 5 to 10 degree bend in the knee at the bottom of his RDL, and he's going to be moving down as low as he can go, and that's the type of position that we're basically replicating. So at the top, when he's got the bar standing up tall, that's the position his hip is in. And then at the bottom, when he's stretching with the weight, that's the position that he's getting in. And that's this kind of active position there. And when he's holding a weight, is he going to be able to go a bit further? Yeah, probably, because we've got this additional passive force. And like that gets stronger and stronger and stronger the further I push him. So that again is something to be aware of, is that range of motion is not just fixed for everyone. So while you may be able to, for example, bring the bar down to the floor and do a really deep stiff-legged deadlift or RDL, another individual mightn't be able to do that. They might get to their kneecap and be like, oh God, you know, that's the end of the range of motion for me. And that's why just having a look at that stuff can be helpful, because when I look at Paddy, I'm like, right, I know that Paddy has a lot of range of motion available. He's a flexible individual. He has good joint awareness and joint control, so I know that he can get into these extreme ranges of motion. So when he does an RDL or a stiff leg deadlift, I expect that type of presentation where he's able to go down nice and deep. However, for an individual who walks in first day and they say, I've never been able to touch my toes. If I'm bending down to tie my shoelaces, I find that really difficult. Then I'm not going to hold them to the standard of saying you need to bring the bar all the way down to the floor, because clearly that's going to be either forcing the person through load alone into a position that they're not really going to be very tolerant of, or it's going to be creating movement from other joints, such as potentially the lower back or even the upper back, or the knees, that someone's going to be using other joints to attain the arbitrary range of motion standard that we have created for them. So as a result, it's important to be mindful of the range of motion that someone has available. So that's the knee and the hip. And obviously all of this is coming back to application. We discussed the leg curl, the leg extension, we discussed the example of the RDL, and you can also do a really applied example of just saying, you know, right, you're standing there, slight bend in the knee, how far can you reach down without bending your back? So you get the person straight back, see how far they can reach to, and then you're like, okay, that's going to be our bottom point for the RDL. That's where we're going to stick with when we get to the bottom of the exercise. So if you see that someone is coming down, they're getting to their kneecap, then you're not going to give them a weight then and tell them to go to the floor, because you know that all the rest of that movement is coming from, as I said, either the weight forcing them further, stretching the hamstrings a lot, which is going to leave them pretty damn sore, especially if they're new to the exercise, or it's going to be movement at the knee and the lower back just to get down to that bottom position. So that's why we always have to think internally, what is the training stimulus we're looking for, rather than just externally in terms of moving from A to B, because they're not the same thing, okay? So guys, hopefully that gives you some insight into what's going on at the knee joint, what's going on at the hip joint during these types of movements. Obviously, we were focusing on the knee joint in terms of knee extension and knee flexion. They're very simple ways you can look at the range of motion that's available, but the hamstrings in particular, and the quads as well, to be fair, they do add an element of complexity here in terms of assessing range of motion, because you do have to consider what position the hip is in to understand why the knee might be restricted, okay, and vice versa. You have to understand what position the knee is in to be able to understand why the hip might be restricted. Because in this case, if we're bending over and the knee is extended, the hip range of motion is restricted, not because of a true, joint restriction or anything like that, but because the hamstrings are in the lengthened position, and that's because of the position of the knee, okay? So hopefully that gives you guys some stuff to think about. As always, if you need more detail, more specificity, more questions, more applications, anything like that, just let us know, and we're more than happy to help you out. Hopefully it gives you something that you can apply with your clients, and of course, help them get better outcomes with their training.